What seems to be a major tipping point in the shambles that is the Trump administration's engagement with the Ukraine war today. A high-level delegation was supposed to be meeting in London to be discussing Trump's final offer peace plan. The details of his plan were revealed by The Telegraph, and unsurprisingly, it would better have been described as a Ukraine surrender plan. And also, unsurprisingly, Ukraine rejected it on sight. As a result, Trump must have had something of a meltdown, sufficient for him to pull the US high-level team of Marco Rubio and Steve Witkoff out of that meeting. Not only that, but J.D. Vance then pitched in with his usual sure touch. So, let's go into it. This was the 7-point peace plan that Trump had been put to Ukraine and to Russia. To Ukraine to see if they were desperate enough to sign up to just about anything yet. To Russia, I don't know, probably to check whether they spelled all the words right, since it could easily have come from Putin's own notebook. Okay, here it is. Point 1, immediate ceasefire in Ukraine. Point 2, direct talks to start between Ukraine and Russia. Point 3, Ukraine to be barred from joining NATO. Point 4, the United States to formally recognise Russian sovereignty over annexed Crimea. Point 5, the United States to effectively recognise Russian grip on 4 occupied Ukrainian territories along the current lines of control. Point 6, Ukraine to sign minerals deal with the United States to share profits on natural resources. And point 7, all US sanctions to be lifted from Russia and both countries to then cooperate on energy and to walk off into the sunset together. You might wonder at the description of that as a peace plan. Points 1 and 2 create the opening for a discussion, fine. Point 3, the US denies Ukraine something it wanted. Points 4, 5 and 7, the US gives Russia things that it wants, 2 of them at Ukraine's expense. And point 6, the US demands that Ukraine gives it something that it wants. Where's the part where concessions are demanded of Putin, you ask? Well, to be fair, concessions are not particularly demanded of anybody. The US just gives stuff that is in its power to give and demands payment from Ukraine, the country that was invaded. America deciding that it will unilaterally recognise all the territory that Russia occupies as being Russian. That basically sets the expectation for those direct talks between Russia and Ukraine that they should just end up agreeing what the US is already recognising. And since the Trump administration has already been proactively dismantling initiatives aiming to hold Russia accountable for war crimes in Ukraine, you can see how that also is part of the deal. Apparently, Vladimir Putin had already offered to Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, that he would go with basically freezing the lines where they currently are. The suggestion he would insist on taking the whole of the 4 regions, including areas that Russia doesn't occupy and had little realistic chance of quickly taking, that was likely always minted purely for the offering as a so-called concession. But all of this still needs the 2 sides to agree for it even to have the illusion of a peace plan that Trump could then declare to be a win. The United States had already threatened to walk away from the process altogether if the 2 sides didn't agree. As we discussed at the time, that was always about putting pressure on Ukraine, because Putin loses nothing if the US walks away. Indeed, if walking away means no longer providing support to Ukraine, including with the intelligence sharing that makes the US weapons they currently have actually usable, he would have to be delighted with that. It's reported that the British representatives for today's talks were annoyed at the way that Marco Rubio had been pressuring Ukraine officials to say yes to a deal on any terms. Ukraine had been coming to the talks in London today, hoping to focus on getting to point 1, the unconditional ceasefire, which so far Russia has not wanted to give. Instead, when they saw the 7-point plan, Ukraine quickly ruled out the idea of agreeing that anyone should formally recognize Crimea as being Russian. This rejection, apparently, is what sparked Trump to pull Rubio and Witkoff from the talks. Trump's mistake remains what it has been since day one. He assumes that because Ukraine is in difficult straits, that it will desperately accept whatever he, Trump, decides that it must. Yulia Svirodenko, Ukraine's deputy prime minister, said that the country was willing to negotiate with the United States, but is not willing to surrender. She said this: "There will be no agreement that hands Russia the stronger foundations it needs to regroup and return with greater violence." President Zelensky reiterated that Ukraine was ready for a full ceasefire, which, after all, is what Trump had been calling for. Then J.D. Vance, speaking from his tour of India, pitched in. He warned both sides, but patently clear that really he means Ukraine, that they had to accept the US proposals as they were or face America walking away. He added that the current lines were going to define how the territory would be divided, and he said this: "We've engaged in an extraordinary amount of diplomacy." That's something he said apparently with a straight face. Diplomacy, You
don't have the cards right now. You're gambling with World War III. Disrespectful to the country, this country.
Have you said thank you once?
Yeah, not really. This is the usual art of the deal from Trump's White House. In other words, no real negotiation, just achieve a position where you have leverage and then seek to force the other side to capitulate to everything that you want from them. The UK responded to Vance's repetition of this ultimatum that we'd also heard from Trump himself a few days ago, saying that it will never walk away from Ukraine. It then tried to spin it as the UK being aligned both with Ukraine and with the US, a juggling act which seems increasingly convoluted. They said this: "We've supported US-led efforts to secure a sustainable end to the war. I think that's what we all want to see. Ultimately, it has to be up to Ukraine to decide its future." Others put the focus back on Russia, arguably where it really ought to be. So, for instance, in his annual address to the Polish Parliament, Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski demanded of the Kremlin, "Don't you have enough land? 11 time zones and still not enough? Take care of better governing what is within your borders according to international law." International law almost seems like a quaint concept from the pre-Trump world order. But of course, if you want such things, you have to fight to defend them. Sikorski went on to describe how things look for a country like Poland, bordering Russia as it does. Anxiety and the question of what will happen have settled in Polish homes. Are we also at risk of Russian aggression? Are the relations between Europe and the United States heading towards a crisis? Can Europe quickly improve its defense capabilities? All questions provoked due to the recent changing position of the United States in the world, you might note. Also worth noting that Steve Witkoff, Trump's hapless envoy, who has been enjoying long chats with Vladimir Putin, had been talking just yesterday about how a settlement in the war seemed to be emerging. Well, sure, that's the sort of outlook you get when you only talk to one side and basically operate on the basis that that side should get everything that it wants. Witkoff, after all, was saying that Putin's desire for all of the territories, including the parts not currently occupied by Russia, well, that was perfectly reasonable and a basis for peace. So, will President Trump really walk away from the table? I mean, it would be the final admission of defeat that rather than him being able to solve the war very quickly and claiming it would never have started if he'd been president, it would be seen very clearly that he is totally out of his depth on such serious geopolitical crises. If Trump can't use the muscle of the United States to bully you into doing exactly what he wants, well, he simply doesn't have a plan B to fall back on. And he certainly hasn't got the skill or patience to engage in proper diplomacy and peacemaking, or even the good sense to hire somebody that does have those skills, rather than sending in your real estate dealer golfing buddy to do it, because no actual donkeys were available, I suppose. But will he walk away? I can imagine at this point Ukraine would be thinking they'd be kind of pretty relieved by this point if he did. After all, right now, the United States is acting as an agent for Russia, trying to force Ukraine into accepting Russia's terms, playing around with things like seeking to destabilize Ukraine politically. You'll recall that senior members of the Trump team initially approached opposition figures in Ukraine, seeking to encourage them to get rid of Zelensky, before it was made clear to them that wasn't going to work. So why would Ukraine think that they would be any worse off now if the United States decided to take its bat home? I can't quite believe that Trump would do that, because that would mean that he would no longer be at the center of the action. And above all else, that is where he really, really wants to be. But he's increasingly being confronted with the fact that his belief that he can do that, because the United States has the power to be the biggest bully in the room, actually works a lot less well in practice than he had believed in theory. Canada refused to cave in the face of it. Greenland and Denmark refused to cave in the face of it. The Israel-Gaza war didn't magically end because Trump told Hamas that if they didn't release all the hostages, then all hell was going to break loose and they would all die. Well, they didn't. The hostages are still held. And no one believes the Trump-Gaza Riviera is ever going to exist outside of AI-generated videos. And Ukraine, whose brave people fought back when Russia invaded and have fought so courageously every day since, well, guess what? They also are not going to cave to Trump's demands that they concede to Putin. That kind of leaves Trump looking a bit of a busted flush. Indeed, right now, it's hard to think of a president who has had all the power of the United States behind them and who has achieved so little with it. I rather think the US will continue to bully, cajole and threaten, and will hang around like a bad smell for quite some time to come on this. And indeed, while I was editing this video, Trump took his meltdown onto Truth Social. Lots of berating President Zelensky for saying Ukraine would not sign a deal that validated the annexation of Crimea by Russia, and which finished with this. The statement made by Zelensky today will do nothing but prolong the killing field, and nobody wants that. We are very close to a deal, but the man with no cards to play should now finally get it done. I look forward to being able to help Ukraine and Russia get out of this complete and total mess that would never have started blah 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 blah. So nothing there about walking away. Still all the pressure on Ukraine. If there's no deal, it's because, says Trump, of Zelensky, as though Russia invading places was, just some force of nature that has to be accepted. So I think we can expect things are going to continue for the time being. Could be that it will move into full antagonist mode. Start doing things like threatening European countries that if they don't stop supporting Ukraine, they will be hit with bigger tariffs or other penalties. I think that's unlikely, not least because Trump may realize that that would quickly turn into another loss, because many would refuse to do it. For now, this is just one of multiple areas where the Trump approach is falling short. For Ukraine, they retain the moral clarity of what they're fighting for, and hopefully the more stable countries support them will continue to do likewise.